Tuesday. Welcome. We are in 1 week, 8 months through 2022. Today I'm going to bring you a little bit different scenario here. We're going to see how this works. I'm going to ask you guys to have a lot more high participation. I've got my partner in crime sitting in here with me. You've probably seen the announcements. So Miss Brenda Davis, you can't see her with me here, but Brenda's right in the same room. So if you guys have questions today, she's monitoring the chat room for me. And don't be afraid to go ahead and come right off mute and ask that question also. Quick plug before we go. Hopefully everybody's watched the video that Alex and I put out last week explaining what's coming in the fall. September 15th, I believe, is our first day. Hopefully you've all taken a look at that and you know that we're doing a very different program that is going to be low education, high level in regards to skill development, and high level of actual activity. That program is going to be $199. Chris and I have discussed there may be ways where you can maybe potentially there's a possibility. We're still discussing that you can get that $199 back. We've got to take a look at how that would work, but know that that's out there. School of Hard Knocks. Make sure that you start putting your name on because again, guys, there's 40 spots. That's it. Make sure you're there for one of those 40 spots. Today, as you can see, let's talk agency and real estate. It has been probably one of the biggest questions that has been coming out, how this really works. And I would also say this, I believe that it is one of the biggest misunderstandings. So I brought my whiteboard with me today. Hopefully all things working, you guys can see what we're going to have with this. So here we go. Let's start with the history of agency. I think it's important to know that prior to 1994, I want you to envision, you as an individual took a listing. So it is the broker's listing. You've taken it on behalf of the broker. You represented that seller. And then take a look around on the screen. And what I want you to notice is that everybody that was in your office also represented that seller. So the broker represented the seller. You represented the seller. Everybody in your office represented your seller. Oh, by the way, take a look around. Now we can separate today. But if you are in the blue crew, everybody in the blue crew within our company represented your seller. This is previous to 1994. Oh, by the way, everybody on this screen represented your seller. So picture this. Brenda here in the Rochester office takes a listing. Obviously, this is pre-1994. Brenda represented the seller. Everybody in the office represented the seller. Everybody in the company represented the seller. But oddly enough, even more, everybody who showed and sold that house represented the seller. That's just the way it worked. See, really, the buyer had no representation. So 1993, with the help of local associations, the Michigan Association, and the National Association of Realtors, it became very quickly that it spread. In 1993, they said, you need to disclose. And that act kicked into place, I believe it was 1994, where it required that we disclose, well, any real estate licensee to a residential transaction, we'll talk to the detail further, must disclose in writing prior to the exchange of any confidential information whom they represent, whom all parties to the real estate transaction, whom they were representing. That was in 1994. that hit. So for most of you, if not all of you, you're going, okay, so why are you even covering this? You need to understand that to get to know where we are now. So now we're here in 2022. There was another thing that came up, and I want you to understand, when we started disclosing, well, we're going to treat all of us today as if we were one company. And that at the top of the chart is HRC. HRC is the broker. How's that look on there? Can you see it, Brenda? Good. Okay. So we've got HRC, who is the broker. And underneath there, that broker has 18 offices. Everybody with me? Just give me this, and we'll pretend to do this. So HRC has 18 offices, of which here's an office, and that office has, well, what, we're about 50. Troy's about 90. We've got Lapeer, I know you guys are around 50. So picture that, every office with all those agents within it. Now, here's this agent office, here's this agent, goes out, takes a listing. Here's our office, we'll go all the way over to Manistee. I hope somebody's with us from over there. They have an agent. Matter of fact, they've got about 8, 9, 10 agents. And here's what it said, because it changed things a little bit. But what it said is, whose listing is best? It is the broker. HRC, it's their listing. So here's what it said. Because although agent A here took this listing, they took it on behalf of HRC, and because HRC has 18 locations with about 500 plus agents, that because this agent knows everything about this seller, that they took it on behalf of HRC, a non-living entity, because this agent knew everything, therefore this non-living entity knew everything, therefore everyone in every office knew everything that this single agent, who's the only individual who's met these people, would know everything. You have to understand that part. That's what was. Well, because of all of that, everybody think about what we do now, and what they created was what we know as designated agency. So now what happens? Here's HRC with all those offices, who has all of these agents, who goes out, takes a listing. It is still the listing of the broker. But what the broker now does is to say, this agent is designated to represent that seller. No one else but that one individual agent. That is designated agency, okay? That's designated agency. The broker designated the listing agent to represent that seller, and no one else in the office, no one else in the company. You can see that that takes care of a whole lot of other issues, because previously what we created was that when, again, I'll use Brenda, when she listed this house, previous to designated agency, matter of fact, previous to agency disclosure, if I brought a buyer, I represented that seller. What do we have? dual agency. What do we have to do when we have dual agency? Redisclose. All parties to the transaction need to know whom we represent. So maybe to fully understand this in the fullest extent, let's go ahead and take a look. Now, hopefully what you guys were able to do prior to, you might have gotten my note last minute, but print out a agency disclosure. We're going to have it here on the screen now so that you can follow along. But obviously you have in front of you, it's going to be a whole heck of a lot easier for you to be able to take notes, see with clarity what we actually have. So let me start out with the very first part of it. Blah, 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 blah. A real estate transaction is a transaction involving the sale or lease. Doesn't matter which one, sale or lease, of any legal or equitable interest in real estate consisting of not less, and this is the key part, not less than one or not more than 4 residential units, or consisting of a building site or a residential unit on either a lot, blah, 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 or a condominium unit. So let's simplify. If you are selling any residential property, house on it or not, or if you are leasing any residential property, 1 to 4 family unit, you must disclose in writing your agency relationship prior to the exchange of any confidential information. Now, I'm pointing that out more than anything else right now, because if I'm a commercial agent, I'm Peggy Feltner, and I'm doing a retail space, or I'm doing a commercial building, or I'm doing a 10-unit residential building. In any of those circumstances, do I have to disclose? What say you? The answer is no. All of those are not residential. So it's only residential, 1 to 4 family, sale or lease, house on it or not, you're selling dirt. If it's residential, 1 to 4 family, or a lot, or a lease, or a sale, you must disclose in writing prior to the exchange of any confidential information. No questions or anything popped up there yet in chat? I'm not getting any notice. Wow, I must be doing really well, you guys. Let's drop down then to a seller's agent and how it describes that. Right at the bottom of page 1 of that 3-page document. A seller's agent, under a listing agreement with the seller, acts solely on behalf of the seller. Blah, 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 blah. A subagent of the seller is one who has agreed to work with the listing agent and who, like the listing agent, acts solely on behalf of the seller. So let's then talk about that for a second, because in the MLS, basically, we don't want you to offer compensation to a sub-agent for that reason. See, it says that sub-agent is one who has agreed to work with the listing agent and who, like the listing agent, acts solely on behalf of the seller. They're working then with the buyer, but they don't represent them. How much control do we have over a buyer's, let me rephrase that with this one. How much control do we have over a sub-agent, an agent representing our seller working on behalf of the buyer? Or, gosh, I can't even say it right. I don't want any other agent representing my seller. As the broker, that non-living entity, we don't want more than one person representing that seller. And when it comes to the aspect that they're outside of our company on top of it, they're poorly trained. I mean, how many companies are getting together on a weekly basis to be able to do what we do? How many companies put on the programs that we do? And if you've been out there working, you know how it can be. I don't want somebody outside of our company representing our sellers. So the reason that we want zero offered as compensation to a sub-agent is so that we sever the responsibility for anything that that agent may do. Okay? Now, if they come in as a buyer's agent or a transaction coordinator, we're fine with that. And let's talk about why we would be fine with it. I think the first part is to just look at the buyer's agent, second page, and it says a buyer's agent under a buyer's agency agreement with the buyer acts solely on behalf of the buyer. So it's the same thing as the seller. They owe all of their fiduciary responsibilities. The buyer contract limiting the scope of those fiduciary responsibilities, but they represent solely the buyer's best interest, the same as a seller's agent represents solely the best interest of the seller. Will we offer full compensation to a buyer's agent? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Offer them the full compensation. Let me drop down then to the transaction coordinator. We'll come back to the dual agent, but a transaction coordinator. A transaction coordinator is a licensee who is not acting as an agent of either the seller or the buyer. They are not an agent. They do not represent either the seller or the buyer. They don't represent either one. Yet they're providing all of the services to get a deal closed without representation. The transaction coordinator is not an agent for either party and therefore owes no fiduciary duty to either party. So how much compensation do we offer to a transaction coordinator? This is the old food for thought. Let me tell you what I've seen a lot of within our company. We're doing 1%. My question is, why? See, it's all about separating our sellers and all of the other agents so that they can't drag us into anything because we've severed that relationship. We do that one of two ways, which is why I think, by the way, the answer to my question would be offer full compensation. Whatever you offer to a buyer's agent, offer that to the transaction coordinator or a non-agent. To tell you the truth, I don't know what the difference is between the two. Offer the same, because see, here's the thing. If we offer no compensation to a seller's agent, a sub-agent, what's left? A buyer's agent or a transaction coordinator. What if the buyer doesn't want representation? And it happens. What's left over for a participating agent, cooperating agent? What are they forced to do? Transaction coordinator. Why would we offer them any less? By the way, I don't want that as an open discussion today because I don't want to limit the number of showings that we might get for a seller when we've met the key part to separating ourselves, severing that tie or that relationship to any other agent. Okay? So that is a key part. So hopefully that makes sense. There's still no. Oh, it doesn't pop it up. Let me just take, no, shows the chat room is still empty. Okay. Let's go back to a dual agent. A dual agent, and I'll read the whole thing with the dual agent here. A real estate licensee can be the agent of both the seller and the buyer in a transaction, but only with the knowledge and informed consent in writing of both the seller and the buyer. I'll get more creative here. So here's Brenda. The broker appointed Brenda to represent this seller. Along comes, okay, Larry, you're in, buddy. So along comes Larry from the same office, wouldn't matter, same company, but if we weren't practicing designated agency, it would make a difference, but she's been appointed to represent the seller. Larry has the buyer over here, and the buyer goes, ooh, I like this house. If we were not designated agency, that would be dual agency. But because the broker, HRC, appointed Larry to represent this buyer, this does not create the dual agency situation because he represents the buyer, she represents the seller. The only dual agency that is acknowledged when you sign a contract is the one up here that says that non-living entity is the only one who's the dual agent and the supervisory brokers. That's just hitting the verbiage. I hate it when I write out myself. Let's draw a little bit different part to this. You got two questions there? The transaction coordinator for the buyer is pretty rare. I will tell you, now, guys, you have a managing broker in your office. You do what they say. I'm going to give my guidance to this. This is coming from experience. It's rare, and I mean rare. I can't give you a circumstance where I would want one of us to act as a transaction coordinator. I don't know what the circumstance would be. I think it's better for us to actually represent one of the two parties, because typically we were doing a transaction coordinator when somebody said, hey, I've already got a buyer for this. We got everything all worked out. I just need you to close it. That's a common one where everybody would want to do a transaction coordinator. And my book is wait a minute. Somebody came to you to have you do this. Somebody was paying you, or at least the paperwork said it did. That's getting a lot more in depth on this. You were representing someone. I'd be quite certain of that. So what's it hurt to represent them? And in that case, let's say that it was 1%. You work with your broker, managing broker, in regards to what that would be. It's 1% instead of 3%. Represent the seller, represent the buyer, represent whoever came to you. And if you knew both parties, represent them both. Do a dual agency. The only thing that changes, commission we charge. That's my strategy. That's my philosophy. You work with your managing broker and what they've got and what may be customary for the area.
I recently had a situation.
Okay, so I'm gonna hold on a second.
Okay.
Did you take yourself off? Are you still quiet? Okay, here we go.
Brenda's muted and we can't hear your mic.
Well, this scenario. It must be my voice is just that much deeper. You guys are still hearing me?
Now,
Okay, thank
yes.
you. Okay, so Brenda had a circumstance where she had a listing. The cooperating agent brought the buyer and came in as a transaction coordinator. He had a transaction coordinator. Bottom line question is that okay? Is that guys, that's totally okay. Because again, we've severed the relationship that I want a severance between them and our seller and us. So a transaction coordinator doesn't represent either party. So we've got that severed relationship because of them coming in as a transaction coordinator. And again, the reason my thought is give them full compensation. I don't care what they do with their buyer. Just don't represent my seller. Don't do something stupid that's going to get my seller and I in trouble. Okay? Anything else in the chat? Yeah. So that question out there, I will confirm. I'm filling out and offering compensation. Sub-agent, 0. If customary for me is the 6, give 3. Sub-agent, you can have 3. I'll put it right down here in the middle of my shirt. You can have 3. Transaction coordinator, you can have 3. I've never had a difference in regards to compensating the transaction coordinator from what I did with the buyer's agent. I just don't want to compensate, again, the sub-agent. I want that severed. I don't want someone else, different company coming in and representing my seller. And that's why I started with reading that seller's agent or the sub-agent. And if they're acting, again, I'll read that. A sub-agent of the seller is one who has agreed to work with the listing agent and who, like the listing agent, acts solely on behalf of the seller. No, I don't know what you've trained on. I don't know what you know. I don't know how smart you are or how illiterate you may be. I just don't want you screwing up what my seller may be doing. That's really the key. So a transaction coordinator is not representing my seller. I'll be more than happy to give them a full compensation share. Make sense? Yeah, so hopefully that answered the question as to what a sub-agent is. And a dual agent, here's the simple part for us guys. Now we're talking our company. We're going to really simple dual agency. Let me give you this quick verbal description of it. Dual agency is when one entity represents 2 or more parties within the same transaction. When one entity represents 2 or more parties to the same transaction. Again, there's a lot that we can do. A half hour is not enough for this topic. So here we go. Office, all the agents. Here's Brenda again. Brenda goes out. Probably too low there. Brenda goes out, takes a listing. Brenda then is out working. She finds a buyer. In working with that buyer, she goes, oh, I got the perfect house for you. This buyer and the seller come together. She's been designated to represent both the buyer and the seller. She is the entity representing two or more parties to that same transaction when they came and said, I like this house. So she is a dual agent, and at that point must redisclose in writing that I now represent you, seller, and the buyer. I'm a dual agent. That has to be done in writing.
What happens if you list the property? I list the property. And then sometime after.
Oh, let me take, here's the one. So right. Brenda's the superstar today. Brenda goes out, takes a listing. She does what we all do. We intelligently set up an open house. Probably used coming soon, you know, that thing. So she holds an open house. And here comes Joe Schmuck. Walks in the door. Brenda says, hi, my name's Brenda. By the way, I represent the seller at today's open house. By the way, that means it's your listing. You didn't hold it open for Brenda. It's Brenda's listing. She represents the seller, not you, because you held it open. You don't represent anybody yet. This buyer walked into Brenda's listing that Brenda is holding open. Must she, because let me clarify further. The buyer goes, I want to buy it. Can I do this with you? Can we do it? Absolutely. We can put this offer together. Is it dual agency? I want you to think about that one for a second. Play Jeopardy. The only way that this becomes dual agency is if for some reason you sign a contract with that buyer. My question would be, why would you sign a contract with that buyer representing them? Why would you disclose to them that you represent them? What do you know about them? Do you need to represent them? You don't need to. Could you? Yes. But do you have to? No. You can't force the buyer into having you represent them. So what Brenda has to do is put the offer together, but what does she have to do prior to even putting the offer together? Disclose in writing, hi, I represent the seller. I would absolutely be happy to work with you, but please know that you want to hold anything back that you don't want the seller to know. Code of ethics requires that we treat everybody honestly, ethically, fairly. But I do represent the seller. And besides that, I want you to do business with me in the future. So I'm going to do things right. Matter of fact, I want the referrals from everybody that you know. So I want to take care of you properly, but I do represent the seller. They sign an agency disclosure agreement that says I'm the seller's agent. There is no buyer representation agreement. Now, I'm not saying that's the case in all cases. There's a lot of different things that we could talk about. Holy cow, it's 12:35. I'm telling you guys, there is so much. Let me address two things. It's got to be hit today because these are things, Brenda, if you could drag it down to the affiliated licensee disclosure and then drag around the designated agency check mark. Guys, this is always checked. You can see affiliated licensee disclosure. Check here of acting as a designated agent. You always are. There's not an exception to that. We are a designated agency company. That blank is always checked. Matter of fact, if you're using Remind Docs Plus, I believe I've got through most of the offices and that should automatically be there. But if not, that top blank is always checked. Because we practice designated agency. Now there's one last one. If you go right to above the signatures under the acknowledgement. Guys, there's a lot of people who don't understand what this says. Let's just read this. The undersigned does or does not have an agency relationship with any other real estate licensee. Now that's a simple question. Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, do you have an agency relationship with anyone else? No. Well, that's a check does not. The rest of it doesn't matter now. The rest of it doesn't matter. However, do you have an agency relationship with anybody else? Well, yeah, Darwin, remember what we told you is, you were referred to us because we're selling our house in Cadillac. So I have the agent up there. Well, gang, they're being represented as a seller. So now it's going to be the undersigned does have a relationship with another agent. And with that, the undersigned is represented as a seller, which tells them it's okay for me to go ahead and sign them up. I can represent them as a buyer because the other relationship they have is as a seller. But if I want to represent them as a buyer and they say, oh no, I've got a relationship with somebody else I signed, it's a buyer. You need further information to see whether or not you can actually sign them up and represent them. That's simply what that acknowledgement part is for. Do you or don't you have a relationship with somebody else? If yes, what is it? If no, leave the second part of it alone. Have them sign, get that acknowledged. Know that we have to do an agency disclosure on any transaction, residential, sale or lease, 1 to 4 family unit. Was there any last minute questions?
Darwin?
Yeah.
Darwin,
Yes, go ahead, Lydia.
I have a question. Let's go back to Brenda's open house. It's her listing and I am
Yeah.
holding the house open for her. And somebody comes in and says, I want to buy it.
You
What
could
happens
feel
then?
free to go through and represent that buyer. And you would be designated to represent that buyer. It would not be a dual agency because you're representing the buyer, Brenda's representing the seller.
Okay,
Okay, so a good clarification question. Again, if it's not your listing and you're just holding it open, you were not designated to represent that seller simply because you held the house open. We're marketing real estate, and frankly, guys, when we hold an open house, we're really simply looking for more buyers, more sellers. That's the reason we're holding the house open. We're hopeful, and our first obligation would be to try to sell that house first.
so my question though is, I don't know the buyer. Why am I going to represent the buyer?
Well, you're going to build over the course of that transaction, you're going to build a great relationship. The short story to that, Lydia, would be you're probably going to do something that is going to represent that buyer over the course of that transaction. Because you don't know the seller and you've now built a relationship with this buyer of which you want them to do business with you in the future. Matter of fact, you sold them the house, you want them to now use you to sell it, and you want all the referrals from them in the future. That's pretty hard to not do anything where we're going to represent them. And you may refer back to your pre-licensed training where there was this thing that we learned about called implied agency. Through our actions, through our words, we can imply that we represent this person. And through that implication, it basically, you've heard walks like a duck, talks like a duck, must be a duck. Well, in real estate, if you walk like a buyer's agent, talk like a buyer's agent, you are a buyer's agent. So if we're going to do something that would end up representing them, why not? Because we don't owe anything to the seller. We were not designated to represent the seller. So entirely up to you, but just make sure you don't cross over the line to be a buyer's agent, or excuse me, to be a buyer's agent. And oh, by the way, what would be your agency that you would disclose? Anyone? Are you a sub-agent?
Would you
No.
repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, so if we take Lydia, your question, if I don't want to represent this buyer who happened to walk into the open house I was holding on behalf of Brenda, I don't represent the seller and I decide I don't want to represent this buyer, well, what would my agency disclosure be checked off as?
Well, it's not that I don't want to represent the buyer. I was always under the impression that you had to have a contract with the buyer. So if I'm at an open house and a person walks and I don't have a contract with the buyer,
Yeah,
with that
it would be
person.
that you would choose to. So my guidance is you don't represent the seller. Go ahead and represent the buyer and putting together that transaction you're going to disclose. So we'll come back to my question that if we stayed with what we were originally talking about, but in this, my recommendation, go ahead and try to get that buyer to be represented. I'm now going to disclose I'm a buyer's agent. I'm going to check that I'm a designated agent, so I'm the only one representing them. And there is no dual agency. I would then follow the agency disclosure with a buyer representation contract. But if they walked in the door, Brenda's listing, but I'm holding it open for Brenda. I do not represent the seller. Therefore, I could represent this buyer, but let's say I chose not to. Again, I'm not sure why we wouldn't, but if they said, no, you can write it up, but don't represent me. What's my agency? What would I check off? Because I don't represent the seller. They don't want me to represent them, or I chose not to represent them. What am I going to choose?
I guess it's transaction coordinator.
Yeah, you're probably either going to be a transaction coordinator or you're going to check off none of the above. Because I don't know what you are, but it's going to be one of those two. But again,
Okay.
it's possible that you would have a buyer who says, no, I don't want you to represent me. I'll just take care of myself. And you can't represent the seller because Brenda's been designated to represent the seller. But you're going to put an offer together, present it, get compensated and cooperate through cooperation. So interesting one. But guys, again, I apologize. I want to be respectful of your time, but this is just one of those topics. It's hard to do in 30 minutes or less. And so I'm going to say, guys, we'll call it officially finished. Maybe we'll have to continue this on, but if you've got additional questions, I'm going to say, please present them to me further, but I'm going to say, hey, thank you for being with me. I'll hang out longer, but if you got to run, I understand, I appreciate that. So we'll call this officially ended. I'll address any other questions that you guys will have then. For those that got to go, thank you for being with us. Well, there, I kind of answered that question. So the request has come, can we have part 2 of this for next week? Let's see, next week, yes, we are still on for next week. So we will have another hot topic next week. Yes, we can definitely continue the conversation, and I may need your guidance as to what questions or what we would still want to address, or I may have to just go back to some of my old information and material to be able to continue this on. Or do we have any other burning questions out there, guys? Everybody's welcome, I can see that. Oh, here was one. If you did none of the above or transaction quarter, would you get paid if not offered in? So, this one came directly to me. So let me read that question again. It says, if you did none of the above, that's what we would check off, that bottom blank for what is the agent's relationship under the licensee disclosure. It says, would you get paid if not offered in the MLS? My thought on that, Eileen, would be yes. And the reason being is a lot of, and I believe, you know, we get so used to it, but I believe here with Real Comp, in many of the MLSs, it doesn't say transaction coordinator compensation. It has NA, short for non-agent, because reality is a transaction coordinator is a non-agent. But probably I would simply get confirmation prior to. I would explain the circumstances and talk with the agent and their broker and make sure that they would be willing to compensate. And in fact, that's another one that we have to take a look at, is how can we be compensated when we might sign a contract. Maybe that's the direction we'll go. We'll do agency and talk about the buyer representation contract for next week. Okay. MLS only offers buyer agent. Yeah. So the question kind of continued. Oh, you guys got a few of them up there. Okay, let me continue with that thought because it came up. If MLS only offers to the buyer's agent, what do we do then? Then we've got to go, hey, I've got a buyer who wants to buy your house. However, you're not offering compensation to a seller's agent. You're not offering compensation to a transaction coordinator, a non-agent. And I've got a buyer who will not allow me to represent them. I can write the offer, but I need to be compensated. And the only way I can do that is to disclose to them as a transaction coordinator or non-agent, would you, under the circumstances, offer the compensation? So we'd go directly to the agent in advance and then get it in writing, because they're not offering in the MLS. You'll need it in writing that they'll actually offer compensation. So that's another great question, clarification to that. Let's see. Allowable percentages to charge. What are the allowable percentages to charge? You have to charge 3% to a buyer, 6% to a seller. We'll keep it in general terms by company policy. If you go less than that, you have to get your manager or broker opinion and approval. Just know what they will allow, because there's some things which in advance they'll allow you to do a lower commission, but you need to know for sure what that is. I would also tell you that for the most part, we used to have a buyer representation contract that didn't state anything. And there's a number of our agents who are putting nothing in the blank. But what does that make the buyer responsible for seeing that you get paid? Nothing. So I'll continue that one next week with your permission, Robert. When we'll go over what the buyer representation contract says and any additional thoughts on agency, how to be able to put those two pieces together and how that will work, not just with cooperation, but compensation. They are two different things. And if you look at the words, that is the way that those two things do work, cooperation versus compensation. Let's see, okay, I think we've got all that we're still there. Guys, do you have any others? You can kick yourself off mute. I don't know how many folks are left over, but. Oh. Wow. So examples of confidential information might be a great question for next week. When are you moving? When do you need to buy? Gosh, they're pregnant. Are you willing to pay over the asking price? How much money do you make? When do you need to move? I mean, think of it this way. There's a, gosh, I mean, because what's dual agency? Dual agency, oh man, there's so much. Basically, it's going to adjust what you're responsible for, and the biggest thing is that you owe 100% confidentiality still in a dual agency situation. So if I would clarify it this way, you in a dual agency situation cannot disclose any confidential information to the other party. Otherwise, anything that could harm either party's negotiating position, you have to hold confidential. So when you think of confidential information, you have to, in your own discretion, know what that would be. But if you gave that information, would it benefit the other party or put the party who shared it with you at a disadvantage? When you think of it from that information, from that direction, it's probably a great way to identify whether or not it's confidential. So anything that could harm either party's negotiating position, if it could benefit the other party, you've got confidential information. Good question. So guys, I think we could probably sit here and talk all day. This is one of my favorite subjects. I love it best when we have open conversation, but this was I think a real key one, and we'll continue it next week by talking any further about what we can come up with and the buyer's broker contract. So there was one other question, or are we all set, Brenda? One last question we'll take. Yeah, I think short restatement of the question was this. I'm holding an open house on another agent's listing. Buyer walks in, and the question is can I go ahead and work with them without having signed a buyer representation contract? And the answer is absolutely. But what did you have to do prior to? Exchange of any confidential information. And how do you know when that's going to come up? You're going to have to disclose your agency relationship. So what are you going to disclose to them at that point? We'll do a lot more in regards to working with buyers, but what I would tell you is that I want to capture the buyer. I want to have an appointment. And a great question to ask a buyer, you know, again, you're going to get confidential information. But know that the buyer's assumption is that you were representing them. Therefore, through your questions and the answers you're receiving are essentially implying that you represent the buyer. Therefore, you are representing the buyer. So now you got to do a disclosure of agency. And if you check off that I'm a buyer's agent, guess what? You just implied agency through your actions, through your words. Matter of fact, you told them, I represent you. Therefore, you are a buyer's agent. Well, if you are going to disclose that you're a buyer's agent, what must follow that? Automatically, no hesitation. Right after this document is the buyer representation agreement. It follows. So the answer is, could I do all of that without ever having to sign a buyer representation contract? Yes. But why would you put yourself and the company at risk?